Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about what topics you should speak with at the FDA and how to prioritize those. There are approximately, you can count them on the pre-star form yourself, but it's approximately 20 topics are listed. But right above that little grid of 20 topics, they say you're limited to four. So you can only talk about with four topics in an individual pre-sub meeting with the FDA. Or if you're asking for an email response, only four. And so when you think about it, well, I'll submit my testing plan. That's what we used to do. But now that the FDA has the pre-star form and they've formally limited it to four topics, your testing plan will probably have more than four topics on it. So number one, usually on people's list, I want to discuss the regulatory strategy. So the predicate selection, the product code that I'm choosing, what type of submission I want to confirm that it's going to be a 510K. So that's one topic, regulatory strategy. And for that, the team lead and that department that's going to be receiving the 510K submission, they're going to be the lead group on that type of question. The second type of question a lot of people might ask about would be biocompatibility. Then you might ask about sterilization. And then you might ask about reprocessing. And then you might ask about software and cybersecurity and usability. And you might ask about benchtop performance testing. You might ask about animal testing. You might ask about human clinical. You might ask about statistics. You might ask about risk management. Every single one of those is a separate topic. And they need different specialists at the FDA for the different topics. So they'll bring in somebody from the infection control group to discuss sterilization or reprocessing. They'll have somebody also from that group maybe to discuss shelf life with you. And shelf life might be a joint effort between the lead reviewer and the infection control group, depending on what is actually aging. Is it the packaging and the sterility that we're worried about, or are we worried about performance of the actual device, like an implant? Another thing that we might look at is when we're designing performance studies, you have basically non-clinical benchtop. A lot of times that's side-by-side testing against a predicate device. And then you might do cadaver studies, and you might do animal studies. You might do a human clinical study. You might have to do usability study. All of those are performance, but each one's a different specialist. So you have a usability specialist that's in the human factors team. You have a medical officer that's responsible for the human clinical. You have a veterinarian that would be responsible for any animal studies if they're necessary. You would probably have the non-clinical benchtop, and cadaver studies would be handled by the person that's the lead reviewer or somebody like that. So all these different specialists come into the meeting. And the reason why they limit you to four is it's hard to schedule these meetings the more specialists you need, and it's harder to answer all the questions in an hour meeting. So limiting it to four topics limits the number of specialists they need to invite to the meeting, which is tough to coordinate. And it limits the number of questions you could ask as well by topic. And then they have one additional limitation, and that's the total number of questions, including all four topics, cannot be more than 10. And generally, you have a tough time discussing more than 5 or 6 in the actual meeting. So you might ask 10 questions, but 4 of them, you might say, I have no further questions. And in a teleconference, you might want clarification on 5 or 6 points. Like, did you mean this? We understand you have concerns. What if we do this? Would that address your concern? Those kinds of clarification questions. But now that you understand you have a limit of 4 topics and you have a limit of 10 questions, and you understand that you have many different specialists at the FDA, how do you prioritize? And if you have 20 different topics you want to ask questions about, it's going to require at least 5 pre-subs. So you're probably not going to ask about 20 different topics. You might ask about 6 or 7, which means you're probably locked into at least 2 pre-subs and maybe 3. The first one is called the pre-sub. The second one is a supplement. It's the same device, same indication for use, but you're asking other questions about other topics on the same device, or you're asking follow-up questions, maybe with a revised protocol and more detailed questions. So those would be what you would use a supplement for. But let's say we're going to plan on best case 2 pre-subs and might have 3. What things should we discuss in the first pre-sub, and what things are more appropriate for the second or the third pre-sub? So in general, you should be very confident about your regulatory pathway right from the beginning. So if you are, then you don't really need to ask questions about that topic. You can, but will it really gain you much? You might be able to unofficially ask a question by mentioning a predicate and using the predicate in your testing plan. And if the FDA has some concerns with that predicate, they would bring it up. If they don't, they're implying that they don't have any problems with that predicate selection without you specifically asking the question. So that might be a way of getting that basic question. Now, that makes a lot of sense when you have a very straightforward regulatory pathway. If you don't have a straightforward regulatory pathway, you might consider having a question just about that, or more than one question just about the regulatory pathway. And if you're not sure if it's going to be a 510K or a de novo, you probably ought to be thinking about a 513G. The 513G uses the same pre-star form that we use for the pre-subs, and you still have to provide a device description and instruction for use, and you have to submit a user fee and a cover sheet for this. But essentially, it's the same basic minimum requirements that you would have for a pre-sub, but instead of asking a whole bunch of questions about different topics, you're really only asking one question: what is the right regulatory pathway? Now, if you think it's a de novo, you could attach additional things, and we talk about that in our 513G strategy and talk about it in our de novo webinars. So check out our de novo webinars for some more information about that. But if you are trying to figure out what is the best predicate, people spend way too much time on that for a lot of reasons. Number one, if I ask the question now, when I actually submit, there might be a new predicate to consider 6 months from now. And that could be how long it takes to get through multiple pre-subs and do all my testing. So what I finally pick as a predicate may not be even available as a predicate now. So that's one reason not to spend too much time worrying about a predicate in the beginning. That's something that could be left to the end. The second reason why you shouldn't spend too much time worrying about the predicate is because you can always change the predicate in the middle of the submission. Not that you want to, but you could. And I've done it successfully where the FDA had a concern with the predicate. We removed that predicate, we put in another one, and we had to modify some things in the E-star, and we had to modify the substantial equivalence comparison, but it was still okay. Where the selection of the predicate becomes important is when you're talking about side-by-side testing. And it is possible to say, well, when we were doing the non-clinical benchtop testing performance, we did the testing against this device because that's what was available. And so that would be one of your predicates. If you are going to pick a second predicate, the reason should be because this one was cleared more recently and it has indications that are more appropriate for what we want. That could be your reason. But the product is not available yet for testing head-to-head or very expensive. So we did the testing against another device in the same product classification that is less expensive and appropriate for the side-by-side testing. And this is getting a little bit beyond the detail level that we would normally discuss in a live webinar or a live video for people. But these are some of the nuances that can happen. So you don't have to lock in your predicate early. It's good to have one or identify several possible ones, but you could just say predicate and have it in brackets and then go change that at a later date once you've decided what the predicate's going to be. The only place the predicate really becomes important is when you are trying to write your side-by-side testing protocols. And is that going to be one of those topics you're going to discuss early in the process or late in the process? That's a good question. So let's dig more into that. What kind of tests do I need to do early and what kind of tests do I need to do late? Regulatory strategy, if I know what the strategy is and it's just predicate selection, maybe I push that off to when I'm talking about non clinical benchtop testing. And let's worry about some other things now at the beginning. Number one, biocompatibility. If I design my device out of the wrong materials, or the selection of materials forces me into additional biocompatibility testing that I wasn't planning on, that has a big cost. If the material fails biocompatibility, let's say it fails cytotoxicity, I would have to explain why it failed, provide a justification, and retest. Probably better off just picking a different material that will pass. So, one of the first things you might want to worry about is your biocompatibility to make sure your materials work. In that biocompatibility testing, if it's an implant in particular, some of that testing can take 6 months because they do an implantation study that takes 13 weeks, and then you have histopathology that you have to do. So the final report takes a long time to get. So it's one of the earliest tests you need to be doing. You also have to use sterile age product for a lot of your testing. So you might want to nail down your sterilization method and your packaging early so you can make sterile age product for the performance testing. So biocompatibility, sterilization method, and packaging should be early just because they're necessary before you get into the later testing. If you've nailed down your materials, you nailed down your sterilization method, you nailed down your packaging, and you know how you're going to age it, now we can get into more fundamental testing things. Electrical safety and EMC testing. You're probably not going to have a lot of questions about it because it's very much, if this clause in the standard applies, you shall do this test. If it doesn't apply, then you have to provide a justification for why it doesn't apply. What is important is you have to have your risk management done very early. The next thing I worry about for electrical safety and EMC is I worry about any kind of software validation. And next, I'll worry about usability. So I have to have my risk management file, my usability engineering file, and my software validation. All three of those have to be done in addition to my EMC testing before I can begin the electrical safety. And the electrical safety typically takes 8 weeks, the EMC 4 weeks. EMC comes first. So that's 12 weeks of work, all preceded by work on risk, software, and usability. So any questions you might have about usability, risk management, or software should be earlier than electrical safety questions because one has to be done before the other. I would probably leave the detailed protocol about usability to the very end because I'm probably not going to execute that final version of the usability study until I've locked in my software, until I've locked in my instruction for use, until I've locked in my use-related risk analysis. I've really nailed that down. So I'd be much more concerned about labeling questions and warnings and precautions and contraindications earlier than those usability questions, because if I add a whole bunch of warnings and precautions, then I have to redo all my usability. So biocompatibility, sterility, packaging, shelf life, and then probably questions about labeling and instruction for use and warnings. And then I would get into things like risk and software and usability. And the performance and the usability would be the last things on the list. And I would prioritize non-clinical at the very beginning. I need to get those done before I'm allowed to do a human clinical. Yes, the human clinical is what costs all the money, and it's very important and will take a very long time, but I'm not even allowed to start it until I've shown it's safe. So I need to do the non-clinical benchtop first. So there's a sequence in which you have to prioritize your testing activities. So that same sequence should be the order in which you prioritize your questions to the FDA and the topics that you bring up in meetings. So your first pre-sub might be talking about biocompatibility, sterility, reprocessing, packaging, shelf life, maybe even get a little bit into labeling. And then your second one, you're going to get more into the risk management, usability, software validation, and maybe even get into some of the EMC questions if you had any, or electrical safety questions. And if you don't have any of those, then you might get into the non-clinical benchtop. Now that we're into the non-clinical benchtop, we might be looking at animal testing as well. We might look at human clinical, and probably the usability is towards the end. I would make sure that my usability is before my clinical, because I don't want to spend money on a clinical study if I'm going to have use errors. I want to make sure the usability is taken care of. But if I don't have a human clinical required, which most 510K devices don't, then I probably would leave the usability to last, and I would only do it after I've done my non-clinical benchtop or any animal testing. So I hope that helps people understand how I would prioritize things and why. I guess understanding the why is as important as anything at all. And if you have other questions or comments, please put it down below in the video in your comments. And if you have any suggestions for next week's topic, please let me know. Hope this was helpful to you, and please share this with anybody that's trying to figure out how to prioritize their testing plans in their next pre-sub. Have a great week, and talk to you then. Bye-bye.